There is a tent on the Ross Ice Shelf in March 1912, and 3 men inside it are dying. They have fuel for 1 hot meal and food for 2 days. 11 miles north of them sits a depot stacked with both. Outside, a blizzard has been blowing for days, and it is not going to let up. One of the 3 keeps writing letters to widows who don't know yet that they're widows. A message addressed to the public. A diary he keeps up until his hand can no longer hold the pencil. 8 months later, a search party digs that tent out of the snow and finds all of it, legible, exactly where he left it. Those pages made him a national hero for the better part of 60 years. Then a book came out and called him something else entirely, Robert Falcon Scott, Royal Navy captain, and the subject of an argument that has been running ever since. He was born on the 6th of June, 1868, in Plymouth, the 3rd of 6 children. His father ran a brewery, which sounded like money, and, for a while, was. There was service in the family already. His grandfather and 4 of his uncles had gone into the army, or the navy, so at 13 he was sent aboard the training ship Britannia as a cadet, and 2 years later he came out 7th in a class of 26. That is a solid result. It is not a remarkable one. Nothing in the first 30 years of his service record points at Antarctica either. He served, he passed his exams, he collected the promotions a competent officer collects. What turned him into an explorer wasn't ambition, and it wasn't a childhood dream of the ice. It was money, and the sudden absence of it. In 1894, the investments the family lived on collapsed. 3 years later, his father died. The year after that, his brother Archie, who had left the army for a better paid post abroad, died of typhoid fever. So a naval officer in his 20s, with no private income of his own, found that his mother and his sisters were now his responsibility. Naval pay went up with rank. Rank went up with distinction. And distinction, for a young officer in the 1890s, was thin on the ground, because Britain had not fought a serious naval war in living memory. Then in June 1899, walking down the Buckingham Palace Road in London, he ran into Sir Clement Markham, the president of the Royal Geographical Society, who happened to be assembling an Antarctic expedition and to be short of a man to lead it. Scott volunteered within the week. He had no polar experience of any kind. The Discovery sailed in August 1901 with about 50 men aboard, almost none of whom had ever worked in polar conditions. What they got done in 3 seasons was real. They charted coastline nobody had seen. They were the first to climb onto the polar plateau, and in the summer of 1902, Scott, Edward Wilson and Ernest Shackleton hauled south to 82 degrees 17 minutes, further than anyone had ever been. They also came close to killing themselves doing it. A seaman named George Vince went over a precipice in a blizzard in March 1902 and was never recovered. Scurvy got into the southern party. The dogs sickened and died, and Scott, who hated the business, ended up shooting the weaker ones to feed the stronger. Almost everything that would go wrong 10 years later was already visible in 1902. Nobody at the time read it that way. They read it as a triumph, and when the ship came home in 1904, the king received him and the Navy made him a captain. On the way back from that southern march, Shackleton broke down. He was coughing blood, he could barely walk, and the scurvy symptoms went into the expedition's medical notes. Scott's decision was that he went home. In March 1903, Shackleton was put aboard the relief ship, invalided out, while the expedition carried on without him. Edward Wilson spent that season keeping the peace between the two of them, which tells you roughly how bad it had become. Shackleton didn't accept the verdict then, and he never accepted it afterwards. He came back to Antarctica in 1907 running his own show, and he based it at McMurdo Sound, the old Discovery ground, after giving an undertaking to work somewhere else entirely. The polar establishment in London was furious with him about it. Scott took it personally, and he had grounds too. From that base, Shackleton got closer to the South Pole than any human being ever had, and turned back only because the food wouldn't stretch. So when Scott announced his own return in 1909, he was not simply racing the ice. He was racing a man he had judged unfit to stay. In between the two expeditions, he got married. Kathleen Bruce was a sculptor who had trained in Paris under Auguste Rodin and moved in a circle that took in Isadora Duncan and Pablo Picasso, which is not the standard biography for the wife of a Royal Navy captain. They married in September 1908 to the Chapel Royal, Hampton Court. Their son arrived a year later, on the 14th of September 1909, and they called him Peter. His father last saw him when the boy was 9 months old. Hold on to Peter. He matters to the end of this story more than almost anyone else in it. The Terra Nova cost £12,500, a Dundee whaler with a bow built to take ice. Around 8,000 men applied to sail on her. 65 were taken. She left Cardiff on the 15th of June 1910, carrying motor sledges, 19 Siberian ponies, 34 dogs, skis, and the firm intention of using all of it. That mixed approach is the single most argued over decision Scott ever made. Amundsen took dogs, and only dogs. Scott hedged. The ponies had been bought in Manchuria by Cecil Mears, who knew dogs and did not know horses, and they turned out to be poor animals for the job. The motors were experimental, and everyone knew it. And when the ponies and the machines were finished, the plan was that men would pull the sledges the rest of the way themselves, on foot, which was the method British expeditions had leaned on for decades and was, by 1910, comprehensively out of date. A telegram caught up with him in Melbourne in October 1910, and it was one sentence long. Beg leave to inform you Fram proceeding Antarctic. Amundsen. Roald Amundsen had told the world he was going north, to freeze a ship into the Arctic ice and drift across the top of the planet. He had taken the funding on that basis. He had kept the truth from nearly everyone aboard until they were at sea. Now he was going south, and the only warning Scott got was a cable that named no route, no timetable, and no landing place. In February 1911, the Terra Nova ran straight into the Fram in the Bay of Whales on the Ross ice shelf itself and came back with the details. The report reached Scott's hut on the 22nd of February 1911. Amundsen was camped roughly 60 miles closer to the pole than Scott was, and he had brought an enormous number of dogs. 60 miles doesn't sound like much. It is a week of hauling in each direction, on a journey where a week turned out to be everything. Scott's public line was that the plan wouldn't change. The plan didn't change. Whether it should have is where the argument starts. In the first months of 1911, the depot parties hauled supplies out across the Ross ice shelf, laying caches the Polar Party would live on coming home. The biggest of them was called 1 Ton Depot. Lawrence Oates, the cavalry officer in charge of the ponies, argued for killing the weakest animals for meat and driving the depot further on, down to 80 degrees south. Scott refused to shoot serviceable ponies. 1 ton went in about 35 miles short of where Oates wanted it. Oates is reported to have warned him he would come to regret that, though the line reaches us secondhand, and Oates never wrote it down, so treat it as a story about him rather than a quotation from him. The ponies didn't last regardless. Of the 8 taken out on the depot run, 2 came back. 3 of them went through the sea ice as it broke up under their feet. Everything the following summer depended on was now sitting 35 miles further north than the man who knew horses had wanted it. That winter, 3 of them did something so strange it has its own literature. Edward Wilson wanted emperor penguin eggs. Emperors lay in the deepest part of the Antarctic winter, and Wilson believed the embryos might show a link between reptiles and birds. The theory turned out to be wrong, and nobody knew that yet. So, at the end of June 1911, Wilson, Henry Bowers, and a young assistant zoologist called Apsley Cherry Garrard hauled a sledge 60 miles to a rookery at Cape Crozier, in total darkness, in temperatures that dropped to 77 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. A blizzard took the roof off the stone shelter they had built. Then it took the tent, which was the one item they could not survive without and could not replace. They lay buried in their sleeping bags in the drift for 2 days, waiting for the wind to drop. And when it did, the tent turned up a few hundred yards away, undamaged by pure luck. They got 3 eggs. They got back alive. Cherry Garrard wrote the book about all of it afterwards and called it the worst journey in the world. He meant that trip, not the one that killed everybody. The Southern March began on the 1st of November 1911 out of Cape Evans in stages, with support parties hauling the loads forward and then peeling off for home one group at a time. Amundsen had left his own base 2 weeks earlier. The road ran hundreds of miles across the flat white of the Ross ice shelf, then up the Beardmore Glacier, 100 miles or more of broken and crevassed ice climbing onto the polar plateau, and then across the plateau itself to the pole. The motor sledges gave out after about 50 miles. The last of the ponies were shot at the foot of the glacier. The dog teams turned back for the coast. From the Beardmore onward, every pound of food, fuel, and equipment those men owned was pulled by those men, on foot, uphill, into the wind. on the 3rd of January 1912, at 87 degrees 32 minutes south, Scott named the men who would go the rest of the way. He had planned for 4. He took 5. Wilson, Bowers, Oates, Petty Officer Edgar Evans, and himself. The last support party turned north, a man short. Bowers had already left his skis behind at an earlier depot on the orders of the day, so he walked the remaining distance to the pole and most of the way back on foot while the other 4 skied. And every ration on that sledge had been weighed, packed, and depoted in 4-man units. The tent was a 4-man tent. Cooking for 5 on a cooker sized for 4 takes longer and burns more of the fuel they were already shortest of. It is the decision Scott's critics return to more often than any other, because unlike the weather, this one was entirely his. On the 16th of January, one of them spotted something black on the horizon ahead. They talked themselves into it for a mile or so. A cairn, maybe? A trick of the light. A piece of their own gear. Then they got close enough to see a black flag lashed to a sledge runner, and around it the tracks of dogs and skis, running away in both directions. The next day, they reached the pole itself. Amundsen had stood on that spot on the 14th of December, about 5 weeks ahead of them. He had left a tent, a Norwegian flag, a record naming the 5 men who came with him, some spare gear, and a note asking Scott to carry a letter home to King Haakon in case the Norwegians never made it back. Scott kept the note. In his diary that day, he wrote the line that everybody still quotes, and it is not a hero's line.
Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority.
Then they photographed themselves standing by the tent, 5 men and a string pulled by Bowers. Look at their faces sometime. Then they turned around and started walking the 860 miles home. Man hauling at altitude in that cold burned something like 7,000 calories a day. Their rations gave them back somewhere between 3,800 and 4,500. That gap was not bad luck on the day. It was built into the plan before they ever left the hut, and it meant every man on that sledge was slowly starving from the moment he picked up the trace. The food was low in vitamin C as well, so scurvy came along with the hunger. Then there was the fuel. Kerosene creeps out through leather washers in extreme cold, and the cans waiting at the depots had lost a good deal of what the ledger said was in them, which meant less hot food and less melted water in exactly the conditions where both keep a man alive. Edgar Evans went first. He had cut his hand badly and it wouldn't heal. He took a heavy fall and probably concussed himself, and Scott wrote that he was absolutely changed from his normal self-reliant self. He collapsed near the foot of the Beardmore on the 17th of February and died that night. Oates went second, and slowly. His feet were badly frostbitten by the start of March, and by the middle of the month he could not pull, could barely walk, and needed hours each morning just to get his boots onto his ruined feet. He knew precisely what he was costing the other 3. Every day he stayed on that sledge was a day they fell further behind the distance they had to make, and all 4 of them could do the arithmetic. He asked them to leave him behind in a sleeping bag and go on without him. They refused. Scott headed the entry that comes next, Friday the 16th of March, or Saturday the 17th, and wrote under it that he had lost track of the dates. That is how far gone they were. That morning, Oates got up, said one sentence to the tent, and pushed out through the flap into a blizzard.
I am just going outside, and maybe some time.
Scott's entry finishes it plainly. He went out into the blizzard, and we have not seen him since. They never found the body. A later search party going south from the tent turned up nothing but his sleeping bag, lying open in the snow. The 3 who were left hauled on for 3 more days. On the 19th of March, they pitched the tent for what turned out to be the last time. 11 miles from One Ton Depot. Then the blizzard came down on them and stayed down for 9 days, and that was the end of it. They had food for 2 days and fuel for 1 hot meal. That depot was the one Oates had argued should sit further south, and whether those miles would have been enough, nobody can say. Scott went on writing anyway. He wrote to Wilson's wife and to Bowers' mother. He wrote to his own wife and asked her to make the boy interested in natural history, which he said was better than games. And he wrote a document he headed Message to the Public, which said that they had taken the risks knowingly, that things had come out against them, and that the men with him had behaved better than anyone at home would ever know. The final entry in the diary is dated the 29th of March, 1912. It says that it seems a pity, but he does not think he can write anymore. Underneath it, in a weaker hand, he added one more line.
For God's sake, look after our people.
The search party went out when the light came back and found them on the 12th of November 1912, 8 months after that last entry, under a low mound of snow with the tips of the tent poles showing. Trygve Gran, the Norwegian ski expert Scott had hired to teach the expedition how to use skis, was one of the 11 men in the party. He wrote afterwards that the frost had turned the skin yellow and glassy, that Wilson and Bowers looked as though they had died in their sleep, and that Scott had not. They read the diaries there, in the tent, then collapsed the canvas over the three of them and built a cairn on top. Gran made a cross out of his own skis and walked back on Scott's, because he thought the equipment ought to complete the journey its owner had set out on. They also found 35 pounds of rock. The polar party had dragged it down the Beardmore and across the shelf while they were starving, and it held fossil leaves of a plant called Glossopteris. It was hard evidence that Antarctica had once been warm, forested, and joined to other continents. For 60 years, he was close to untouchable. Then in 1979, a journalist named Roland Huntford published a book setting Scott against Amundsen, and the verdict in it was savage. Scott came out of it, a bungler and an amateur, an officer promoted past his competence, who ignored the advice on dogs, mishandled the rations, muddled his orders, and got 4 men killed through vanity. It was dramatized for television in 1985, and for a generation that was simply the view. The pushback has been slower, and it isn't finished. In 2001, Susan Solomon, an atmospheric scientist, went through the expedition's own weather records. In the middle of March 1912, the temperatures on the shelf ran 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than that stretch of ice usually delivers at that time of year, a cold snap you would expect to see about once a decade. Her argument is that no realistic plan survives it. Ranulph Fiennes, who has hauled a sledge across Antarctica himself, went after Huntford directly in 2003 and called Scott a great historic hero whose name had been dragged through the dirt. David Crane, in 2005, landed between the two. And in 2012, the researcher Karen May turned up a written order, dated the 20th of October 1911, telling the dog teams to come out and meet the returning party. That is the exact instruction Huntford said he never gave. None of it settles the case. He made real mistakes, and he got genuinely unlucky, and which of those you weigh heavier still seems to depend on what you already think Britain was in 1912. The news reached the outside world in February 1913, when the Terra Nova put into Oamaru in New Zealand and the story was cabled to London. What followed was enormous. A memorial fund closed at £75,000. A wooden cross went up on Observation Hill above the old base carrying the closing line of Tennyson's Ulysses, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Cambridge got a Polar Research Institute that is still working today. And then there is the boy. Peter was 2.5 years old when his father died on the ice, and the letter asking Kathleen to point him at natural history rather than games did its work. Peter Scott founded a wildfowl trust in 1946. He helped found the World Wildlife Fund in 1961. And he drew the panda that has been its emblem ever since. The most recognizable conservation symbol on the planet was designed by the son of a man who starved to death on the Ross Ice Shelf, on the instruction of a letter written in the tent. He did not get there first. It did not get back. He hauled 35 pounds of rock down a glacier while he was starving, because he thought the science was worth more than his own odds, and a century later people are still arguing about whether that makes him a fool or the best of us. Maybe the argument is the reason he lasted. Amundsen won it cleanly and got a paragraph. Scott lost badly and got a library.